Howdy, everybody.
Armor on the soil. Armor on the soil.
Armor on the soil. What does that actually mean? Well, I'm autistic, and I have a tendency to take things very literally. And so when I first heard the term
armor on the soil,
I had images of the soil being covered with big pieces of metal, like roofing on the soil. Of course, after I thought about it, I said it won't work, because if you cover the soil that much, nothing will grow at all. So that couldn't be it. I looked into it further, and I came across Gabe Brown's book called Dirt to Soil. And in that book, Gabe talks a lot about keeping armor on the soil. There's 5 components that he identifies that are crucial for building healthy soil. The first of those is minimizing soil disturbance as much as possible. Plowing or any other kind of disturbance that resembles plowing destroys the soil ecosystem. Microorganisms in there wind up dying. It interrupts all the fungal networks that are in the soil. And when you plow, you have bare soil. Well, where in nature do you see bare soil? Nature hates bare soil. What nature does is it tries to cover that soil as quickly as possible. And it does that with weeds. So weeds go in and invade the open part of the soil that you've just plowed. You could think of weeds on bare soil as like a bandage on a cut. Like you had a gash in your arm or something and they had to put a big bandage on there. You could think of weeds like that for the soil, a bandage on an open sore. So now, what do you have to do? You have to get an herbicide and apply the herbicide to kill the weeds. Well, when you put the herbicides on there, you're literally ripping the bandage off and going backwards from what nature wants. And then once the weeds are dead, now the soil is basically dead too. Now you're going to put chemical fertilizer on there to help things that you want to grow actually grow. That's going to cause actually more weeds to grow because, like I said, it's open soil. And you've entered into kind of like a twilight zone of an endless cycle in which you're plowing, you're disturbing the soil, you're applying herbicides, you're applying chemical fertilizer, and it's like you have to keep doing it. There's no end to it. But you are the one who caused the problem in the first place when you plowed the soil. So you caused the problem, and now you're paying for it. So how do you stop? Well, Gabe Brown's 5 components of building fertile soil is how you do it. So the first is minimal mechanical disturbance to the land. The second is diversity. Again, where in nature do you find monocultures? A monoculture of corn or of wheat, we could find those all over the place because that's what we do, humans do. But where in nature do you actually find a big field of anything? It simply doesn't happen. There's a diversity. So monocultures don't exist in nature. And so we shouldn't try to make monocultures exist in nature either. So you want to make sure that your soil, your fields are diverse. The third is armor on the soil, which we'll get to in just a minute in more detail. The fourth is to maintain, as much as possible, maintain a living root in the soil all year round. And then the fifth is to integrate grazing animals into your system. Now, this oftentimes is overlooked, but grazing animals can have a huge positive impact on the health of your soil. So it's those 5 things. And then finally, context envelops all 5 of those. So you have to consider your context. What might work where you are and your context might not work for me. And so that has to be considered. So again, when I first heard the term
armor on the soil,
it was a seminar that Gabe Brown was giving. And I came to realize what Gabe was talking about. Initially, I thought it meant that you're going to put dead material covering the soil, like what we have right here. All of this is dead grass that's been cut on the soil. But then that was refined to refer not just to dead material, like leaves and other things. You know, nature cycles throughout the year, and you get detritus on the ground that is going to decompose, going to put carbon into the soil. But the other aspect is having grazing animals trample the grass and the plants that are in the field. And that is another thing, because in some cases those plants aren't really dead. They're just trampled, they're on the ground. They haven't died yet. And they may not die for quite a while. But they're laying down there, they're covering the soil, they're lowering the temperature in the soil so that the bacteria and the other microorganisms are happy. It's not being beaten down directly by the sun. So it's dead material, potentially live material that's been trampled by animals, and then having a living root in the soil, which is number 4 on Gabe Brown's list. So cover crops is a way that you can cover your soil. So if you have an area that you're planting for a cash crop, you're not going to have that cash crop all year round. So during the times that you're not planting the cash crop, you're going to plant a cover crop to keep the soil covered. So I concluded that armor on the soil meant to keep your soil covered with either dead plant material or living plant material all year round. Now in our context, here in Nicaragua, that's a difficult thing to do because we're in the wet, dry tropics, and because of global warming, the dry part has increased. It used to be, we would say, that you have 6 months of wet and 6 months of dry. We don't have that anymore. We have just a few months of wet and all the rest of it is dry. So keeping living roots in the soil all year round is a very difficult thing to do in Nicaragua without an elaborate irrigation system. We don't have the funds to be able to do that, and we don't actually have access to the water to be able to do that either. And I'm not even sure that it would be a responsible use of that resource. I took this very seriously, so I went out. This high grass here, I'd come out with the scythe and cut all this grass down. You could see that I've cut some of it down here with the scythe. And so I went out before the dry season and said, I have to cover the soil. And I'm not going to be able to keep it covered with living matter, so I'm going to have to try to do it with the dead matter. But I very quickly realized that this dry matter is subject to the sun. It wasn't actually decomposing with microorganisms. It was going through another process called photodegradation. And photodegradation is when the sun itself, the rays of the sun, break all the chemical bonds in the material, and it basically just turns to dust. And it releases carbon into the atmosphere. That's the opposite of what I want. I want the carbon in the soil. I don't want the carbon going up in the atmosphere. That's bad for the global warming, but it's also bad for the soil. So then I said, I'm going to have to think about my context and how I can do this in a way that is going to take advantage of the context here and make sure that whether we have the sheep in here trampling some of this material or whether I'm cutting it with a scythe, that this material is decomposing with microorganisms and not decomposing with the sun as much as possible. We're still going to get some photodegradation. There's no way to get away from that. So I changed my whole approach. This is a silvopasture system in which we have a swale and some fruit trees and other trees and then another swale, and in between is a pasture, and then another pasture up above and another pasture up above that. So I bring the sheep in here during the wet season because I want the sheep to trample the grass during the wet season. From the rain, it's going to cause a decomposition with microorganisms. So this largely open pasture, there's a few trees in here, but largely open pasture, I make sure it's grazed during the wet season and trampled. And then as the dry season approaches, Linolita Farm has both pasture areas and wooded areas. And here you can see one of the wooded areas that is on the farm. And I bring the sheep into the wooded area because the sheep actually like to eat the leaves of a lot of the trees. So I have them come in toward the dry season because I don't want them trampling things anymore out here in the open pasture where photodegradation is going to occur. I want most of the decomposition to have already happened by the time the dry season comes because we have very intense sun here. We're only 12.5 degrees north of the equator. We have very direct sun, very intense, and that photodegradation occurs, and it really defeats the purpose of having dry matter on the soil. So now I have a system within my context that hopefully is going to work. Now, do I think it's going to work perfectly? Probably not. I'm going to have to make more adjustments as time goes on. But at least right now, this is the strategy that I'm using. It's a long-term strategy of building soil, and let's see if it works. So with that, I'm going to end the video. Thanks a lot for watching.